Hello and welcome to End Zone Focus. This week we get a reaction to the political turmoil in Iran following the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And shortly I'll be talking to a Middle East specialist with the Transatlantic Institute, Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi. Also we visit Burma for a report on former leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who spent the last 14 years under house arrest in the capital, Rangoon. And we'll also be looking at the spiritual phenomenon of exorcism. In light of the recent court case involving the death of Janet Moses, Scott Kelso has been talking to two Christian leaders about their experience of exorcism. Do they see it as being a blessing or a curse? Well, that story later in the programme. In the 2 weeks since Iran's President Ahmadinejad was re-elected, it's been estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iranian opposition supporters have taken to the streets in the capital, Tehran, calling for an investigation into alleged election fraud. And Iran's supreme leader, Ayotollah Ali Khamenei, has conceded that there may have been some minor irregularities. Well, despite the government-sanctioned crackdown on independent media, which has led to foreign journalists being arrested and expelled, Iranian protesters have continued to put their eyewitness reports on YouTube, highlighting what they say are atrocities against innocent people. One of the international correspondents who's been closely following the elections is Emanuele Ottolenghi. He works for the media think tank Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, and he files for publications including The Guardian and The Wall Street Journal. Well, Emanuele, welcome to the programme. Thank you so much for sparing time on your way through to the airport to come and see us. Iran is it seems to outsiders to be a very fluid situation. Is that the case?
It's possible that the regime will lose control of the situation. However, this is a regime that has made a clear decision to fix the elections in such a blatant, in-your-face fashion that I would assume, if push comes to shove, the regime will use whatever means it has to bring the situation under its full control. They will be ruthless and they will not back down.
Because President Ahmadinejad said it was a landslide for him, but Mr. Mousavi says it was rigged, and in fact he didn't even win in his own hometown, did he?
Well, one of the things that looks a little suspicious is the fact that you have such a uniformity of the result across the country. And Iran is quite a diverse society, especially in the periphery. You have non-Persian ethnic minorities, so therefore it seems a little suspicious. It's true that the impression and the understanding we get in the West about Iran comes from Western reports which are mainly focusing on the capital, and that may be a little misleading. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Ahmadinejad actually did win the elections, but clearly the majority he was given in the final results that were announced, and the fashion in which that was verified, indicates that's been significant tampering.
We've seen pictures mostly shot from people's phones, which have been smuggled out on Twitter and Facebook and whatever, of huge protests in the streets of Tehran. Are we revisiting 1979? Are we seeing the sort of protests when the Shah was deposed?
In 1979, the revolution was successful for a number of reasons. You had, first of all, a charismatic leader. You had a compelling ideology, this combination of revolutionary Marxism with Shia Islam, the subversive married with the divine. You had a fully mobilized and well-organized opposition which went beyond and transcended the Islamists and included all sectors of society. Of course, afterwards, those who did not subscribe to the Islamist ideology were disposed of, but in the meantime, they participated in bringing down the Shah. So, to answer your question, one has to look whether these elements are there today, and I would say that they aren't. You don't have a charismatic leader. Mousavi has been able to become, to some extent, a symbol of this whole protest, because anyone in the current circumstances would have galvanized the reformist camp. But he is not in a position to assume the role that Khomeini had 30 years ago. Society itself is not well organized and mobilized. The reformist camp had a chance in the 90s, but the regime has repressed it by closing down newspapers, jailing unionists, torturing people, intimidating students, and so on. And there is no compelling ideology that can rally people around. In addition to that, people still remember the revolution, certainly the older generation, with dread, because it did lead to an enormous amount of unrest, violence, and suppression. So I don't think there is so much appetite for such an upheaval today, and I suspect that eventually the regime will come on top.
The population of Iran, something like 70% of the population is under 30, so they would have no recollection of that revolution. Is there like a generational split here?
Well, clearly the youth is on a different planet, if you wish. It's very young. It's restive, therefore. It's severely affected by the economic downturn. You have a very high level of unemployment, which in a traditional society is even more upsetting, because a lot of people unable to make a living cannot marry, cannot move out of their parents' home, cannot start a life. So clearly you have there a reservoir of discontent which provides a potential for change. The problem is, again, the fact that the regime over the years has been able to use repression to a point where this youth who could be mobilized is actually is not very willing to become politically active. The price to be paid for that kind of activity and activism is simply too high.
Let's talk a bit about Iran's relations with the rest of the region and with the world in general. I mean, it was listed as part of the axis of evil by the US in the past. President Obama seems to be making some diplomatic overtures to Tehran. Let's start there. Does he have a hope of making any sort of diplomatic inroads into Iran?
Well, I think that if the election results stick, and in my assessment they will, President Obama will have a very hard time convincing this regime to make changes. It's a regime that is involved as a spoiler in just about every single area of crisis, instability in the region, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Lebanon, Yemen, even in Sudan. They come down on the side of the revolutionaries, of radical movements, and so on. So they feel confident. And Ahmadinejad made it abundantly clear. The nuclear program, which is the biggest bone of contention with the United States, is a given by now. He's not interested in negotiating. The regime wants to move beyond that and considers itself safe enough from outside pressure. So President Obama will have a lot of difficulties, and I think that this is a litmus test for him. President Sarkozy earlier this week very, very bluntly called this election a fraud. And at the same time that European leaders come out in such a strong, unambiguous fashion on the side of reformists and people who support freedom and opening up the society, America, which is the leader of the free world, has a president who says, I don't want to interfere or meddle with the internal dynamics of Iran. So that's a bit puzzling, and I hope that America will realize that it's going to be very difficult with this regime to come up with anything constructive.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break there. And my studio guest is Middle East commentator Emanuele Ottolenghi, and we'll be back to continue our interview on Iran right after the break.